Is there anything unique about the early 21st century in terms of the social and the economic forces that are shaping our world that should make us more concerned, more wary about what's going on? Or technological forces?
In Tehillim, the Psalms of King David, it's maybe it's in Mishlei, the Proverbs. Somewhere in the Jewish Bible it says, "Ein chadash tachat hashemesh." There is nothing new under the sun. And as a student of history, all of the trends that seem so unique to us are echoed by the past.
One thing that certainly isn't unique about our age is the clash between propagandists of illiberalism and artists like Franz Kafka and Václav Havel trying to nurture smart citizens. It happened throughout the 20th century, particularly in Central European countries like Hungary and Czechoslovakia. And it's happening once again today. One of the most notable skirmishes of the latest chapter in this timeless war took place in the Hungarian capital Budapest between the Viktor Orban government and the George Soros-funded Central European University. The university's Budapest campus, which has now been shut down by the neo-authoritarian Orban regime, even had a room dedicated to one of the great critics of mid-20th century totalitarianism, the Viennese philosopher of science, Karl Popper. Why name a room after Karl Popper? We even have his photo on the wall here.
Karl Popper is an Austrian philosopher of science, and Popper is at the origins of the idea of the open society. The key insight that Popper had is that you can't have a democracy unless you have a certain scientifically based pursuit of knowledge. Societies that don't have a way of testing knowledge and refuting knowledge and slowly advancing what is a true picture of reality are flying blind. And his claim was that open societies are less likely to fly blind than closed societies, the totalitarian societies of the 20th century. And we're a university with an open society mission, i.e. all we're trying to do here is get young men and women from countries around the world to understand that there is such a thing as knowledge.
Whatever the spin doctors of fake news might promise us, knowledge certainly does exist. And understanding this fact in a social media world corroded by ill-informed opinion and outlandish conspiracy theories is critical to an open society. So how do we transmit Karl Popper's notion of indisputable facts, particularly that critical body of knowledge which educates citizens about the institutions and practices of democracy itself? One way is by transforming today's digital platforms of self-expression into tomorrow's virtual classrooms of democracy.
In fact, I actually think the opportunity for fixing democracy using those platforms and using technology is enormous. I think people overplay how they've undermined democracy. I think they underplay how much they can do to fix democracy. Why wouldn't Facebook be telling people, here are the 3 branches of government, here's your responsibility as a citizenship? That's nonpartisan, that's bipartisan. The platforms can do that.
But we can't rely exclusively on private Silicon Valley companies to educate citizens about the public realm. Government, the traditional guardian of public space, is also important in establishing innovative educational programs about democracy.
I think ultimately we could talk about as many policies as we like, we could talk about as many different solutions to democracy as we like, until we educate our citizens about how to engage better with our democracy, there is no long-term fix.
How does that happen, that education?
So I think we need to think about more innovative methods. So I don't think a box standard classroom will be able to solve this issue. But I think we need to, if you look at Germany, for example, they have a whole government department called DFB, which is focused on democratic engagement, and it runs all the way from early years all the way to sort of much older age groups.
But relying on government educational programs may be a rather 20th century solution to a 21st century problem. You see, in today's cacophonous social media age, in which we are all simultaneously talking, the biggest educational challenge is teaching citizens how to shut up and listen. The best acoustic of democracy in today's attention economy, then, might be the sound of silence.
You know, this idea that we had in the 20th century that more self-expression was more freedom, which was kind of embedded in jazz music and art and, you know, in poetry. It was, you know, one of the great messages of the 20th century. You know, Trump is basically like a modern artist. I mean, he's like a verbal modern artist. It's like, you know, he's like a Jackson Pollock painting come to verbal truth. And but the trick is now that the more you speak, the more kind of social media companies know about you, the more data is collected about you. You know, the more you reveal of yourself, actually, the less power you have, because you can then be sort of targeted with various campaigns.
So democracy may be silence. If there's a sound of democracy, it's silence.
But that also seems to me the toughest one. That's kind of it's like a Trappist thing.
The point of free speech is not speaking, it's listening, it's engaging. And that's something that's in danger of being lost in the contemporary society.
So how do we learn to listen?
I think the honest answer is that we teach our kids how to listen, and that everybody has a responsibility to do that as a good parent.
And of course, the most effective way for parents to get their kids to listen is by telling them stories. Do you have children, Lou?
I do. I have one daughter.
And what should parents do if they want to nurture children who respect democracy?
Parents who want to nurture children who...
Lovers of democracy like you.
Parents who want to nurture children to not just respect democracy, but to love democracy, must tell them stories. The greatest weakness in democracy's fight with illiberalism, whether it's Putin's continuation of the czarist practices, he's just a 21st century czar, or Orban tapping into old nationalistic religious themes, or Benjamin Netanyahu with I'm a liberal Zionist, a Zionism that I don't recognize on Netanyahu's part, or Mr. Trump. We liberal Democrats must have stories. We need powerful narratives. Liberal democracy is relatively new. It just dates from the 18th century in its current form. We're battling ideologies, some of them, that are the worst of millennia. So we need our own stories. So tell your children stories about democracy.
The most popular story about democracy, of course, remains the one about its birth in ancient Greece. So one of the most captivating things about contemporary Greece is the way in which antiquity and modernity coexist. But what about when it comes to democracy? How can the retelling of this story about the Athens of the 5th century BC help us innovate 21st century democracy? At a time when democracy is in crisis, when anti-pluralist populists are sabotaging the very idea of citizenship, when nobody seems to be listening to anyone else anymore, when traditional political elites are no longer trusted, when public space has been colonized by trillion-dollar tech companies. What new lessons about democracy can such an old story teach us?
I think we've got a problem for representative democracy at the moment, because the idea of representative democracy was about delegating very, very complicated decisions and trade-offs, complex trade-offs. People now seem to want very, very quick, simple solutions. And I think part of the story of trying to fix this problem is to try to involve, to really involve more people more systematically. And so one of the things I was thinking of is why not go back to some historical experiences. Getting a format which involves a continuous engagement is, in my view, really essential for the rescuing of the democratic process.
Did the ancient Greeks really invent democracy? Maybe, maybe not. Certainly the so-called democracy of classical Athens, with its denial of political rights for women or slaves, is not only foreign, but also deeply antithetical to liberal democracy. And yet, while we need to avoid falling into the nostalgia trap of fetishizing antiquity, there is one chapter in the Greek story of democracy that is worth retelling today. That's the story of citizens' assemblies, the Greek lottery system for nurturing active political engagement. It's this civic format that can help us rescue our democratic process.
The radical elements of the Athenian democracy is the fact that people participate in the council based on a lottery system. They are not elected, but they are selected by the lot. And this is very radical.
Today's citizen assemblies are innovative riffs on the Greek model. They are marrying the most promising elements of the direct democracy of 5th century BC Athens with the best deliberative practices of 21st century liberal democracy.
I think citizens' assemblies have an important story to tell about how democracies can innovate. When we talk about citizens' assemblies, the thing we have to remember is we're still at a very much an experimental phase. We're still quite early in the development of these things, and we have to see how it unfolds. And so in a sense, we're learning from ancient Greece in one respect, which is that we have at the heart of this random selection of citizens.
What has to happen, though, is that politics and administration actually realize that the way they may have taken decisions in the last decades is not the way of the future. So if we say we have big infrastructure questions coming up, we have digitization, we have globalization, and people want to be involved in those decisions, and they don't only want to go to the polls every 4 or 5 years, they want to be actively involved in between. So, for example, you probably know the British Columbia Citizens Assembly for Electoral Reforms, where they had citizens work up a new election law.
Countries all over the world, from Canada and the United States to Spain, Germany and Ireland, are now all using citizen assemblies to innovate their democracy. In Ireland, for example, citizen assemblies were used to rethink controversial abortion laws. And what the Irish case showed is that this kind of innovative experiment in deliberative democracy can not only revitalize 21st century citizenship, but can even get people to start listening to one another again.
But where we develop it further from the way the Greeks would have done it, is that the other ingredient of a modern day citizens' assembly is deliberation, by which I mean you have round tables with a trained facilitator at each table to make sure that the group of citizens at that table all have equal voice, all have the chance to say their piece. And that's really important to make sure that the process is fair and equal for everyone.
And did they explain why they picked you?
He said it was random.
So you won the lottery?
Basically, yeah.
Or you lost the lottery?
Well, whatever way you want to look at it. The culture, if you like, or the atmosphere that was created within the Citizens' Assembly was the sense that we've been given a very important job to do, and we took that very seriously, and we had a huge amount of respect for each person around the table because we knew that each person was giving up their time and was there for the greater good. I suppose the biggest learning, the biggest thing I've taken away from this whole process is at the core of democracy is listening. People need to be able to be given facts and to be able to take those facts on board. So it's listening, but it's also asking questions, and it's getting really good answers to those questions. People assume that we sat in round tables at the Citizens' Assembly and spoke all the time, just speaking at each other, everybody trying to wait for their turn, dying to speak. It's not really how it was. It was mostly people asking questions. It was people trying to figure out, did you understand what he said? Did you understand what that was? Did you get that? And was that connected to that? And should we be putting those two things together? It was really much more workshop style than talking shop.
So there you have it then. From Berlin's Brandenburg Gate to San Francisco's Battery Club to Budapest's Karl Popper Room. From the sonorous promise of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony to the cacophonous reality of online fake news. From the 5th century BC to 1989 to today, that's this story, my improvised jam session about democracy. Allegro, I hope, not andante, the music of democracy. But what exactly have we learned from this symphony of voices? How do we fix 21st century democracy? So, Michael, how to fix democracy? What are we going to do about it?
Yeah, that's an easy question.
It is, of course, anything but an easy question. Fixing democracy requires us to confront the great social, economic, and cultural disruptions of the early 21st century. It means making tomorrow a more compelling soundtrack than yesterday. We must reform capitalism, reinvent the internet, and rethink education. That means confronting the inequality caused by both Wall Street and Silicon Valley. It means fighting the xenophobic racism and sexism stoked by nostalgic populism.
The solution is not hand-wringing, it's not despair. The solution is optimistic action, fighting for our democracy.
Yes, the way to fix democracy is through action. And that involves another A word, agency. Human agency, the power to shape our buildings, to shape our tools, to shape our societies before they shape us. Agency, the power for all of us to be sovereign over our own lives.
In the end, it is about the agency of individuals to help carve their own lives. Men, women, black, white, that's the heart of liberal democracy.
As both its essential cause and effect, human agency is the chicken and the egg of democracy. But outside of a dystopian novel, there will never be an agency app on our smartphones or a government department of human agency. As that most human of qualities, agency is something we do ourselves. It requires each of us to vote, to demonstrate, to take responsibility, to be accountable, to listen respectfully to others, to shape the future before it shapes us.
I go back to the community, go and ask, what can you change in your neighborhood, your block? Because you can become frustrated thinking you're going to change Washington. You may by voting someone in or voting someone out, but you can change your block. You can change your neighborhood. You can do it in coalition with others. It sometimes requires you to stand up and say, all right, I'm going to take it upon myself.
Above all, human agency requires all of us to be political. It means fighting against today's creeping illiberalism, which is undermining both political pluralism and individual sovereignty. That's the story that we should be passing down to our children, the symphonic power of liberal democracy.
You've dedicated your life to public issues, to the public space. You don't have any children. It seems like everything you do is built around public service. What drives you? How do you explain your life?
Justice. And from an early childhood, I never liked bullies. I would even interfere to my disadvantage when a 10-year-old beat up a 7-year-old on the way to school. And I had a lucky choice of parents who said, if you want freedom, you have to have civic responsibility next to it. We have to have an understanding of the details, you see, and it's no more difficult than learning how to play bridge for a championship game. It's no more difficult than learning some of these video game rules that are so bewildering. So I say, wake up, people.
Yes, wake up, people. That means you, me, and everybody else watching this movie. Wake up to our timeless responsibility as human beings to be good citizens. If we want freedom, we need civic responsibility too. After all, we get the kind of democracy we deserve. So wake up, people, to our collective power, both in the past and in the future, to make the world a better place.
And I've got to say this, what I have found is that there are those who are willing to listen. And that is where the hope in democracy lies. I mean, when you look at, for instance, in this last 2018 election, the voter turnout rate was record-setting. I mean, it was higher than it has been since the 1920s.
So really when it comes down to it, Carol, you're as American as anyone. You're an optimist.
Oh, yes. You cannot be black in America. I mean, you know, think about it. You know, my ancestors were enslaved. If you get mired down in, Lord, this is only as good as it's ever going to get, my ancestors would remain enslaved.
Such optimism about the future of democracy isn't just wishful thinking. Today, in 2020, people all over the world are indeed waking up and pushing back against the backsliding of 21st century democracy. From Hong Kong to Tunisia, to Chile, to Russia, to Iran, to the Czech Republic, to the United States of America, 2020 may represent a new beginning in our collective desire for freedom. No, not 1989 all over again. Just as history doesn't end, it doesn't repeat itself either. But those ill winds which have, over the last 20 years, sabotaged democracy's progress, may be finally subsiding. The democratic future then, our future, has promise. But only we can realize this promise by building democracies of our own. Only we, you and I, can collectively author the music of democracy.
Check it. I run through your zone like it's land I own. Easy come, easy go, like cash I've blown. I've shown in the fire the desire full grown for the higher empire to arrive full blown. Roam around the planet making money, having fun. Got the pedal to the metal, never settle till I'm done. See, I do these jobs, money comes with ease, but I can't stop, it's like I got a disease. So nothing to do but hop in my fast car, forget the speed limit like I'm driving NASCAR. Party with my people over in Madagascar, then on the way home chillin' Casablanca. Tricks of the trade got me made like a mobster. They kept it in a safe, but I cracked it like a lobster. Everything was fast until I downshifted. Now I can see in this life I've been gifted. Walk how I walk, and they can't do that. Talk how I talk, they can't do that. Move how I move, and they can't do that. Groove how I groove, they can't do that. Walk how I walk, and they can't do that. Come on, talk how I talk, hey, yo, they can't do that. Move how I move, and they can't do that. Yo, groove how I groove, they can't do that. Yo, the root of all evil is the love of cash. Yo, I got a little bit, now I'm driving fast. Tricks doing what they do, but I'm moving past. I got to pump the brakes to avoid the crash. I walk how I walk when I walk to survive. I drive how I drive, got no choice but to thrive. I hit the ground running on the day I arrive. Now it's time to shift this whole thing into overdrive. Check the dash, tank full of gas. Everything's